The next question is from our executive director, Cole Harrison. He says in the chat that the Democrats have a centrist wing and a progressive wing. Aaron, how do you evaluate the degree of difference between the two wings on foreign policy questions like Russia, Syria, and Venezuela?
Well, like you have people like Ro Khanna, who has been very um, determined in standing up to the war in Yemen, and Bernie Sanders has joined him in that. And when it comes to Israel Palestine, Bernie Sanders has, I think, done a lot to move the Democratic Party left on that. He certainly deviates from the rest of the party traditionally, which is just unconditional support for Israel. But then you have areas where there's total convergence. So, for example, the Caesar sanctions on Syria that prevent Syria from importing food, medicine, that destroy its economy, that force doctors to smuggle in medical equipment. Tulsi Gabbard was against that. I'm not sure who else was though. I don't. It was passed by a voice vote, so it's not recorded. Whether there was any opposition, but you don't hear people speaking out against that. So, and Bernie himself, even though traditionally he has a history in his own personal life of, being involved in foreign policy issues, you don't see him speaking out about that much. Um, he hasn't spoken out about that as much anymore, and it wasn't as big a centerpiece of his whole movement as I personally would have liked it to have been. But he's understandably maybe just focused on issues at home because he thinks that that will attract the most support. But so while I think there are bright spots overall, I mean, who is standing up to the dirty war in Syria? Who is trying to impose constraints on the fact that we spent billions of dollars destroying a country and are now imposing sadistic sanctions. In the case of Venezuela, I mean, I mentioned it before, where Max Blumenthal asked AOC about Venezuela, and she didn't give him an answer. She said, we're putting out a statement, and she didn't really ever speak up. In Bolivia, there was some criticism of that, of the coup in Bolivia, but it's just not an issue that I think nearly enough progressives are active around. And the problem is that suffering people around the world, they have no lobby group really in Washington, and they have no vote. So, like if you're from a point of view, just strictly cynical politics, like if you speak out against sanctions on Syria, for example, somebody's going to call you an Assadist and a Putin puppet. And so you have to weigh, I guess, like let's say you cared about suffering Syrian civilians, as you should, but let's say you cared about them, but then you have to weigh the cost of that against how your enemies are now going to use that against you, and that might hurt your own constituents because your constituents can vote for you, but suffering children in Syria can't. And that's kind of the dynamic that I think helps silence people in Congress, is that you don't gain anything by standing up for the world's most vulnerable people who we're attacking, who we're depriving of medicine and food. It's just there's nothing to be gained politically from that. So it takes a real conscience to be able to overcome that. And I think Tulsi Gabbard had that, where she even went to Syria in a bid to try to stop the proxy war. I think Dennis Kucinich had that. But you look at what happens to those people. Whenever they speak up, they get attacked. They get smeared as being pawns of whatever the foreign enemy is of the day. And same thing, I've experienced that, to a certain extent with the Russiagate and covering this OPCW scandal with Syria. I get called all these names, and I don't mind that. But when you're a politician, you have to, I imagine that has a very strong deterrent effect, because that affects your fundraising. It takes up your time. You have to spend your time answering smears, and people end up getting intimidated into doing nothing. So, but that's where the progressive movement has to come in, because we're the ones who have to stand up for people who have no voice at all in Washington. And people who have even less of a voice in Washington than the masses of people here, of low income people here, are the masses of low income people around the world. They have even less of a voice. So that's where we come in, and that's why at the Gray Zone, that's who we try to center in our work, is speak up for the people who are targeted by regime change policies and dirty wars and sanctions around the world. Because when, to the extent that the media covers them, it's to essentially support what is being done to them. And so that's where we see our role, is to counter that.